Lawrence Auster is a leading critic of American immigration policy. He's the author of The Path to National Suicide, which is subtitled An Essay on Immigration and Multiculturalism. When I first met Mr. Auster several years ago, he mentioned that he was working on a book, and I asked, a book on immigration, and I asked, well, what's the title? He said it's The Path to National Suicide, and I knew immediately that here was a kindred soul. He argues that the post-1965 immigration and its unintended consequences are the transformation of America into the multiracial majority-less country, and in fact has the effect of explicitly delegitimizing the majority population. Forbes magazine has called his book devastating and definitive, and Patrick Buchanan says Mr. Auster's questions are not only valid, they are imperative. And I think you'll find that his analysis is one of the most thoughtful, eloquent, and persuasive that you'll hear this weekend, which is to say it's one of the most thoughtful, eloquent, and persuasive that you will hear until we have the next American Renaissance. Lawrence Auster.
Thank you very much, Jared. As I was working on this talk, the original topic, which was multiculturalism and the war against white America, it evolved a little bit. That topic is still there, but it's subordinated to a larger topic, which I think could be called the truths about race and the costs of denying them. Everything we've heard so far at this conference and what we're going to hear rests on two bedrock truths about race and race relations that go against everything that we have been taught. The first truth is that there are significant differences in average intelligence between different populations, and that such gaps in intelligence cannot be closed by any known human means. The second truth is the fact that not all groups are equally assimilable to each other, in the sense of their ability to come to share a common outlook, a shared historical memory, identity, and way of being. It's all a matter of degrees of difference and of numbers. The greater the historical, cultural, religious, and racial differences between two peoples, and the greater the numbers involved, the harder assimilation is going to be, and the more likely permanent conflict between such groups, two such groups living in the same society. Now, today's mainstream orthodoxy states the opposite beliefs. First, that all groups are equal in abilities, and second, that all groups in the world, no matter how different, are at bottom basically alike and are equally assimilable into American culture. The belief in the equality of abilities leads ineluctably to the idea that any actual differences in achievement between races must be due to discrimination, which is to be overcome by preferential racial quotas in everything from college admissions to the administration of the death penalty. The second belief, which is that everyone in the world is equally assimilable into American culture, has led to an immigration policy in which the United States is admitting, as we all know, over 1 million immigrants a year, 90% of them from non-European countries, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia. That influx, combined with the higher birth rates of the immigrants, has already reduced the white European part of our population from almost 90% in 1960 to under 75% today, and will turn America into a white minority country during the coming century. Several major states, such as California and Texas, will have white minorities within a decade or two, and of course many of our cities already have non-white majorities. Now, in trying to describe or understand the cultural impact of this demographic transformation on America through immigration, I think it might be a useful approach to compare it to the impact of minority admissions on a university. And in this regard, I went back and I looked at an article by Dinesh D'Souza about 4 years ago in the American Scholar. in which he laid out in a very interesting way, step by step, the way that affirmative action ultimately it leads to an increase in race conflicts on the campus and to the destruction of liberal education. So what I'd like to do is go step by step through D'Souza's analysis and then return to the immigration question. This is the way it goes. First, one, in order to satisfy affirmative action goals, large numbers of minorities are admitted into a school for which they are not qualified, even while those same students have been told over and over that they are perfectly well qualified. Two, on beginning their studies, the affirmative action minorities soon become frustrated at their inability to do the academic work and by their feeling that they don't fit well into the university community. Seeking comfort and security against what they now perceive as an inhospitable environment, they become attracted to separatist organizations. Three, these groups tell the students that the reason for their academic difficulties is racism. Since there is no overt racism to be found, a subtle institutional racism is made the culprit. Four, these charges by the minorities place the school's administration in an interesting spot. The administration cannot admit that the real cause of the minorities' academic problems is the fact that they are indeed unqualified, because that would make the minorities feel bad and would also make the administration itself look bad. So instead, the administration agrees with the minorities that there is indeed racism at work, and that this racism is the source of the minorities' problems. In effect, the administration makes the entire university community, especially the white students and the faculty, the scapegoat for a racial inequality that was created by the administration itself when it admitted unqualified minorities. Five, the administration then sets up mandatory anti-racism programs, sensitivity training, speech codes, the whole coercive machinery designed to uproot this endemic white racism that is the supposed cause of the minorities' poor academic performance. Six, when all these steps still fail to improve their academic status, the minorities identify a new scapegoat, the curriculum, which they say is culturally alien to them because it largely consists of intellectual works, models, and standards created by white people. In effect, all traditional studies proceeding from Western culture are denounced as racist. The solution is the dismantling of Western culture, which is considered unrepresentative of the school's non-white population, and the adoption of multicultural curriculum and intellectual standards that conform with minority cultures and learning styles. Seven, when white students express resentment at these things, the minority activists and the school administration, in D'Souza's words, quote, conclude that they have discovered the latent bigotry for which they have been searching, unquote. This racism, they say, only proves that more needs to be done. More preferential hiring and admissions, more multiculturalism and minority studies, and of course, more anti-racism training. 8, meanwhile, the white students secretly suspect that the real cause of all these problems is that the affirmative action students are not qualified. Even though it is forbidden to express that thought out loud, the minority students sense that attitude among the whites, which only confirms their own suspicion that the whites are indeed racist and exacerbates their own race consciousness, the minorities' race consciousness. In sum, the result of admitting large numbers of unqualified minorities into a university is that whites start to be demonized as racist and are systematically silenced, while their civilizational heritage is attacked as unrepresentative and illegitimate and is systematically dismantled. Now, if all the above things happen when you admit large numbers of non-whites into a predominantly white school into which they don't fit, what happens when you admit massive numbers of non-whites into a predominantly white society into which they don't fit? The very same things happen. The white majority starts to be demonized as racist and is systematically silenced, while their civilization is attacked as unrepresentative and begins to be systematically dismantled. The great irony is that the admission of non-whites is supposed to prove that the society is non-racist and egalitarian. Yet the more non-whites that are admitted, the more racist and unequal the society and its institutions come to seem. Now, this analogy is obviously not exact. In the case of the schools, as discussed by D'Souza, the main reason for the minority's inability to assimilate into the university is a lack of academic abilities. In the case of immigrants and society as a whole, the main reason for the failure of assimilation is the gap of cultural identity and way of being between the rising non-white population and the diminishing white majority, although, of course, gaps in ability are also an important factor. Another flaw in my analogy is that in the schools there is a radical academic establishment that is actively pushing the multicultural revolution, while in the larger society, well, of course, there are elites there too, but yet it is not radical politics so much as the sheer force of numbers of recent immigrants and other minorities who, by their very presence, transmute the character of the communities and institutions in which they reside. However, despite these differences, the essential process is the same. I repeat it once again. A large cultural proletariat is introduced into a host society. This cultural proletariat's failure to fit into the society is blamed on the society itself rather than on the fact that they were admitted in the first place. And finally, the character of the society is dismantled as it slowly accommodates itself to this new population. Now, there are many manifestations of this we could look at. Some of them are well-known: multicultural education, political correctness, changes in the law, immigrant rights, and so on. But in no other area is this dismantling more obvious than in the arts, and I'd like to focus on that for a few minutes. Cultural institutions in regions with large third world populations are abandoning the Western high culture tradition in favor of third world folk cultures. According to music critic Edward Rothstein, writing in The New Republic, the new immigrants are not interested in Western music. Quote, "Strikingly, in a city like New York, classical music culture is largely a racially stratified culture as well. There are almost no black or immigrant faces, aside from Asians, to be seen in concert halls. My neighborhood arts organization, like many others around the country, has been unsuccessful in marketing Western art music to the new racial and international communities in the area. So instead, they've begun presenting the folk musics of immigrant and black cultures." A similar problem can be seen in the theater. Discussing the decline of the Broadway theater, critic Thomas Dish, who writes for The Nation, says, quote, "The reason that Broadway appeals less to New Yorkers these days isn't just that Broadway has changed, so have New Yorkers. A glance around the lobby at any Broadway show reveals who isn't there. Any of the city's readily identifiable minorities: black, Hispanics, Asians. It isn't just the expense," Dish continues. "It's the fact that New Yorkers no longer have a common culture. The melting pot has been replaced by a mosaic, the separate components of which regard one another with apathy or contempt." Now, theatrical companies try to address this problem by introducing multiracial casts into Western plays. But the director of one such multicultural production in Washington, D.C., was disturbed to find that the audience was still almost exclusively white. Evidently, third worlders are simply not attracted to Western theater, even when it has lots of non-whites in the cast. Ultimately, the only solution will be to give up Western theater altogether in these areas. The arts institutions of Boston have come under attack because, according to the Boston Globe, they do not represent, quote, "the racial groups that are expected to make up more than 40% of the Boston population by the year 2000 and to exceed the white population 2 or 3 decades later." The Boston Ballet, seeking to answer these charges and the other charge that the classical ballet is a racist art form. Why is it racist? Because it grew out of the white monarchies of Europe and because it has excluded blacks and other minorities. Well, to overcome this charge, now has a free training program for minority dancers. Out of its 48 current dancers at the Boston Ballet, 9 are minorities. And the artistic director of the company says he will racially transform both the dancing company and the audience by the year 2000. In the words of this artistic director, "Critics say, but it's not going to be the same art form. My answer to them is, it never is." There are so many people who say, "But it won't be pretty and pink." And guess what? I don't think it will be. It will be very exciting and vibrant and dynamic and meaningful, and that's what it has to be. Standards won't drop, he adds, but they'll be different. And you can put that up on your wall as the very motto of multiculturalism.
Well, stage raving late.
Because of our changing racial composition, artistic images of American history are coming under attack. And Sam Francis has already referred to this. Rush Limbaugh recently was very upset that the state of Oregon, after having commissioned a beautiful bronze statue of a 19th century pioneer family on the Oregon Trail, had rejected the completed statue because the image of a white pioneer family was considered racist and non-inclusive in today's Oregon. Now, while Rush, who's a good fellow, was very upset about this incident, it didn't seem to occur to him that it had anything to do with demographic change, and that as our society becomes increasingly non-white, any all-white grouping, whether in art or in politics or business, is increasingly seen as non-representative of our population and therefore illegitimate. Last fall, this has also been referred to, there was an angry protest by Black and Hispanic students at the University of Massachusetts who wanted to get rid of the school's official symbol, an image of the Minuteman. They charged that the picture of a white man carrying a gun was racist. For the time being, the administration has resisted this demand. But how long will they hold out? As the university's white population continues to decline, can we expect the Chinese and Pakistani students of the future to care enough about the Minuteman and what it represents to defend it against intimidating Black and Hispanic protesters? Who will preserve the symbols of our historic Anglo-European culture after whites are gone? Indeed, who will defend it even now while whites are still a majority? In Long Island this spring, a school production of Peter Pan was canceled at the last minute after 6 weeks of rehearsals because it was felt that the portrayal of the Indians in Peter Pan would be insulting to the town's American Indian minority. Now, and remember, if you haven't seen Peter Pan in recent years, the Indians in Peter Pan are part of this fantastical scene taking place in Never Never Land. It has nothing to do with any realistic portrayal, whether positive or negative. So now, to accommodate multiracial America, this beautiful, poignant classical play that we all remember with fondness from our childhood is to be proscribed. The most significant thing about this event was that no one in the town, including the parents whose children had their play taken away from them, seriously protested this outrage. In an even more horrifying example of white surrender, an elite private school near Boston was considering hiring a multicultural curriculum consultant named Enid Lee, a Black woman who is one of the leaders in this field. When the school's board of trustees found out that Ms. Lee had said in an interview that her approach would make white children feel intimidated and guilty, the trustees, after some discussion, went ahead and hired her anyway. And by the way, one of the members of the trustees who pushed most strongly for her hiring, this is a wonderful touch, happened to be the head of psychiatry at Children's Hospital in Boston. I could go on with many more examples, but it's not necessary. The prescription of Peter Pan, the hiring by white parents of a diversity consultant who announces in advance that she is going to intimidate their children, are symbols of what is happening to our entire country and culture. As America becomes more and more non-white, everything we think of as American and Western culture will be either censored, squeezed out, or transformed into something else. Now, in response to these worries about multiculturalism, the objection we hear most often from establishment conservatives is that these problems are not created by immigrants, but by alienated American elites, as well as by the general moral disarray in society. And if you go to any, neoconservative or establishment conservative function, for sure somebody's going to make that point, and that will get the strongest applause. It's not the immigrants, it's ourselves who are the problem.
Yes.
Well, there is no question that the radical and liberal elites in the schools, governments, media, and corporations are doing everything that they can to destroy whatever is left of traditional America, and that they would be doing so even if there were no immigrants at all. It's also true that unless America reverses this moral decay and the cultural radicalism coming from within itself, the country will be finished in any case. But there are two things we must remember. First, the destabilizing presence of so many immigrants makes the elite's job of destruction a lot easier. And more important, even if there were no radicalism within our society and institutions, the kinds of demographic change we are having would still be enough by itself to destroy our culture. And the list of horrors to prove this point goes on and on. The growing dominance of the Spanish language in southern Florida, including a recent law passed by the Hispanic majority in Dade County, undoing their official English law and allowing Spanish to be a language of government. The third worldization of Southern California, with Hispanics firing guns in the air on holidays in the middle of Los Angeles, and Mexican illegals living 30 people to a house in the municipality of Orange. The disappearance in these Hispanic-dominated areas of the culture based on the Bill of Rights and Anglo-American understandings of law and behavior. Multiracial juries unable to reach verdicts in major criminal trials because the jury members don't share any common understanding of reality. The exodus of hundreds of thousands of whites from California and other affected areas every year. The booming population of Laotian Hmong in the upper Midwest, as in Wausau, Wisconsin, where Hmong females starting in junior high school have about 10 children each, and where 2/3 of the Hmong are still on public assistance, in a town which 15 years ago was 99% white, and is now riven by ethnic gangs and battles over school busing. Animal sacrifice cults from the Caribbean, which are now constitutionally protected under a recent Supreme Court decision. The takeover by Dominican drug dealers of Upper Manhattan, where Dominicans marched with huge banners denouncing 500 years of genocide after one of their drug dealers was killed by a police officer in self-defense. Muslim extremism and terrorism. Expanding Chinese criminal networks, operating as part of a worldwide criminal empire, and many other internationally based criminal empires as well that I won't mention here. I think Wayne Lutton might go into that later. These and many other disorders are occurring not because of government-sponsored multiculturalism, or because of radical elites, or because of middle-class moral decay. They are happening as the direct result of revolutionary changes in this country's ethnic and racial composition, which it cannot absorb, and which are now turning it into a very different country. Well, we've all asked the question, what is it that prevents whites from protesting their own demographic and cultural dispossession? I used to believe that it was because whites simply didn't know what was going on. And if they did know, they would rise up and something would happen. But I've been disillusioned of that notion. When Time magazine came out with a cover story on immigration, the changing colors of America or something about 4 years ago, the spring of 1990, stating very clearly, middle of the 21st century, whites will be less than 50% of the population. When that article came out, I thought, man, this is it. Now people are finally going to get it. You know, I had written the same thing in my little book, but maybe a few thousand people had read it. Now these ideas are going to get out, and now a real debate is going to start. Nothing happened. Silence. Same thing too about 2 years later. The Census Bureau made it official. White minority by the middle of the 21st century. Nothing. Silence. Acceptance. So whites do know what's going on. Many Californians, more probably than any other part of the country, are horrified by what's happening in their state. They feel that they are losing their culture. But then why in the world don't they resist it more forcefully? Well, many answers we could go into. One common answer, the most common answer is the fear of being called racist. And there is great truth in this. And it's not just a negative truth. It's not just a despicable thing. Deep in the American mind, there is the idea that the United States is universal, and that the essence of America is that it doesn't matter who your parents were, that in America anybody can get ahead and so forth. Now this formula can work well enough with reference to individuals, and has worked, but it becomes completely absurd when we're talking about entire populations of diverse culture and race. Then we realize that policies which are presented as race neutral are not race neutral at all. I came across an audacious example of this in the coverage of the South African election. Amidst all the media's joyous talk about a non-racial or multiracial democracy being born, Newsweek, in the middle of the election, came out with a sensational cover with bold letters crying, "Black Power." So deep is the doublethink in which we live today that I wonder if more than a handful of people in the country noticed this gross contradiction. But as the South African case indicates, what non-racial really means is that it is whites who are supposed to be indifferent to race in order to help non-whites advance their racial interests. Thus, the belief that all the peoples of the world are equal in intellectual abilities presents itself as a race-neutral or non-racial idea, since it's saying that race doesn't matter. But since the races, in fact, are not equal in abilities, this non-racial belief in equality turns out to be completely racial. It is claiming that blacks, on average, have the same abilities as whites, i.e., it's claiming that blacks have far greater abilities than they in fact have. It claims further that any actual black inequality must therefore be due to white racism, and that it is the duty of whites until the end of time to strive to make blacks equal. Thus, this apparently non-racial liberalism turns out to be a kind of black racialist mythology. Similarly, our immigration policy, which is thought to be race neutral, is in fact turning America into a non-white country, dispossessing and ultimately destroying white America. Yet it is considered racist to oppose this policy, but non-racist to support it. Ultimately, the pursuit of race blindness, in anything more than a legal sense, leads to complete incoherence. John Carroll, a columnist in the San Francisco Examiner, once complained that we are supposed to respect everyone's differences, but at the same time, we're supposed to treat everyone equally, which requires us not to notice differences at all. Carroll continues, one is required to deny the evidence of one's senses. I perceive that African American men are different from Caucasian men, are different from Asian women, are different from what? Ethiopian Jews. Can we compare these differences? No, we cannot. We may say for the record that these differences are beautiful, equally beautiful, precisely, geometrically, equally beautiful. But that's it. And Carroll continues, if we do begin to compare these differences, that leads us right back to value judgments about those racial differences, which immediately devolves into racism. Paralyzed by these contradictions, as well he should be, Carroll concludes, quote, I think intermarriage may be the only way out. Of course, we'd lose a lot of interesting specific cultures that way, unquote. Now what he means, of course, is that we'd lose a lot of interesting races that way, including our own. Along the same lines, but with far more enthusiasm, Morton Kondracki in the New Republic wondered how America could overcome its racial inequalities and decided that racial intermarriage is the only solution. He said, it would be a lot easier if each of us were related to someone of another color, and if eventually we were all one color. In America, this can happen. Racial intermarriage is even more aggressively promoted, of course, by Ben Wattenberg, who sees it as the path to universal salvation. Now, I want to be very clear about the meaning of all this. And maybe I'm being a little repetitive here, but I want to emphasize this point. Modern liberalism said that racial differences don't matter. And on the basis of that belief, it then tried to turn America into a multiracial, integrated, race-blind society. But now that very effort has created so much race consciousness, race conflict, and race inequality that those same liberals have concluded that the only way to overcome these problems is to merge all the races into one. The same people who have always denounced as extremist lunatics anyone who expressed concerns about the racial dilution of white America are now proposing not just the dilution of white America, but its complete elimination. Race-blind ideology has led directly to the most race-conscious and indeed genocidal proposal in the history of the world. So this is the insanity that results from thinking that race doesn't matter. And the moral paralysis of whites that we were trying to find the answer to comes from the terror or the distaste that whites feel at saying that race does matter. There is also the inability to face the fact that whites are indeed a civilizationally distinct group, comprising only about 15% of the world's population, and that they are demographically threatened by the rest of the world's desire to move into white societies. If whites continue to be open to non-whites, as their race-blind moralism tells them they must, their societies will cease to exist. But if they exclude or disengage from non-whites, that will require them to be harsh, unkind, mean-spirited. It will require them to say that they care about the survival of their race vis-a-vis other races. To the contemporary white person, such an idea seems utterly evil and unacceptable. But the odd thing is, and I think many of us may be discovering this, is that there is really nothing evil or horrible about this idea at all. It turns out to be the most reasonable and commonsensical thing in the world. It is the current race-blind ideology, which is insane. So, before we recoil in horror or embarrassment from speaking explicitly about race, let us remember that America's current politics is already a race-conscious politics, only it's a politics based on lies about race, it's a politics directed against whites and their civilization, and it pretends that it's not about race at all, but that it's race-neutral and universal. So instead of today's race-conscious politics, which is based on lies about race, let us have a race-conscious politics based on truths about race. These truths include the following propositions. 1. Long-term harmonious relations between a racial majority and racial minorities are only possible when the minorities do not exceed a certain percentage of the population. 2. While individuals of different race living in the same society can get along on a basis of equality and mutual recognition, entire races living in the same society cannot. 3. In the right circumstances, individuals or small groups of one people can be assimilated into a host culture of a different people, but there are limits to such assimilation. Certainly, if the entire people associated with the host culture is displaced or swamped by a different people, the host culture will also disappear. Even smaller numbers can be enough to delegitimize the host culture and produce chronic cultural conflict. 4. Therefore, the culture, identity, and traditions of white America and Western civilization cannot survive in any community or institution that becomes multiracial and or a white minority. 5. Because of the greater attractiveness, prosperity, and openness of white Western societies, non-whites will continue moving into them as long as they can. Therefore, white America can only survive demographically and culturally if it recognizes itself as a threatened ethnoculture, if it ceases or drastically reduces on a national scale all non-white immigration, and if it assures on a local scale communities where its own institutions may survive. Such local autonomy would require a return to constitutional federalism, limiting the power of the central government over local communities and institutions. Six, the large and enduring differences in average intelligence between blacks and whites means, first, that blacks, on their own, can never be expected to maintain a modern, democratic, civilized, advanced society. And second, that blacks can never be expected to achieve collective economic equality and other kinds of equality with whites. The forced attempt to achieve such equality through affirmative action and through endless attacks on white racism as the supposed cause of the inequality can only break down all the institutions and standards of society and lead to race warfare. 7, there are therefore only two sane options for black-white relations in this country. Either blacks accept the above facts, accept a society where white Western standards of law, behavior, and intellectual life are dominant, and where advancement will be open for blacks only on an individual, not a collective basis. Accept their status as an ethnic minority and be grateful to be living in a white society where they have goods and opportunities undreamed of in a black society. Or else, if blacks are not willing to accept these things, then to avoid race warfare, there must be peaceful separation between the races. Once again, these propositions have nothing to do with any notions of race hatred of the other or of race worship of one's own. White people are just as sinful and imperfect and limited and mortal as any other people. Unlike ideologies such as Afrocentrism and Nazism, which are based on a superhuman glorification of one's own people at the expense of others, this new politics is based on a Christian recognition of our human limitations, namely that we do not possess the godlike power to create a perfect world where everyone is equal and where differences don't matter. If there is any arrogance to be seen today, it is in our current immigration policy, which is one of the greatest examples of hubris in the history of the world. The irony is that whites are terrified that non-whites will hate them and start a race war if whites say these things and begin to stand up for themselves. Well, the truth is that many non-whites will begin for the first time to respect whites. Currently, minorities don't respect whites because whites have defined themselves ideologically as nothing, while in personal and practical terms, they still try to protect their self-interest. Whites thus seem both weak and hypocritical, and therefore despicable. So non-whites just keep moving into the vacuum left by white surrender. But when whites begin to assert their own civilizational and racial identity and their desire to preserve it, not in a hateful way, but in a calm, intelligent, and firm way, then non-whites will begin to see whites, not as the cartoon-like oppressors of liberal demonology, but as human beings who have the same basic interests and concerns for their people and culture that the minorities have for theirs. Minorities will also begin to recognize that their own demands in increasing numbers are indeed threatening the culture and existence of white America, something they had never realized before because whites had never said so. Such assertion by whites will utterly transform our current politics. At bottom, all we are doing is making an appeal to justice. The injustice and unacceptability of the current double standard will become obvious to any person of goodwill once it is pointed out. And that is why the principles I've described need to stand at the center of an anti-multiculturalist, pro-Western civilization politics in this country. In my view, given current demographic realities, any conservative politics that lacks these principles cannot be a serious politics. Finally, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, God pronounces the curse that will fall on the people of Israel if they fail to follow God's law. Your sons and your daughters shall be given to another people, while your eyes shall look on and fail with longing for them all the day. And it shall not be in the power of your hand to prevent it. A nation which you have not known shall eat up the fruit of your ground and of all your labors, and you shall only be oppressed and crushed continually, so that you shall be driven mad by the sight which your eyes shall see. Unless America wakes up to the threat of demographic and cultural extinction and finds the will to resist it, this is the fate that awaits all of us. Gee, only 35 minutes. I thought I'd be running over time.
No. Take the question.
Sir?
You mentioned the European, the immigration from other places is just 90%, so not more. Okay, where's the other 10% white comes from?
Where are the current European immigrants coming from?
The non-white is 90%.
Right.
Where's the other 10% that is white come from?
I don't know the breakdown of that. There are a lot of Irish, and of course there are a lot of Irish illegals because they've been closed out from the recent quotas. I think there are a lot of Central Europeans. I really don't know the answer to that. I'll have to check that.
Do we allow any South Africans?
No.
White South Africans?
I don't know that there are any South Africans coming. There ought to be. I mean, they would have the same quota as any other country in the world. I don't know the answer to that.
The answer is no. They're going to New Zealand.
Well, a lot of American blacks, there was a story in the news recently about this, are moving to South Africa. They think they have a more promising future there. Maybe we can arrange Fallon?
Can I try to respond to the gentleman's question? With regard to the immigration, it's a little tricky. If you look at the sources, you have 90% coming from the third world. 1993, I think they said 17% for that year came from Europe. Immigration from Europe doesn't mean European immigration. You have third world re-immigration to the United States that's coming through the European quotas. So for Britain, you're not getting necessarily Irish and English or Scotch coming in for that quota, 20,000, whatever. You're having Pakistanis, you're having Asian Indians. In fact, for Denmark, you're having Chinese and Koreans. So while the figures are 90% are from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the 10% on average for the last 15 years from Europe is misleading because it's a woeful exaggeration of the European population that is coming in. And that's something that's not really clear or clarified in the discussion. There is a third world's coming in two ways, directly, 90%, and indirectly. How much of that indirection, what percentage of that indirection composes that 10% from Europe? That's what's not known because the government doesn't keep figures on ethnic breakdowns by European countries.
Thank you. Rabbi Schor.
In terms of the two scenarios that you painted for us, Larry, as far as the first scenario goes, which is to judge all men as individuals, I'd like to ask you how you can square that with what you portray as the demographic future of the country. In other words, even if we would treat all men as individuals, eventually the point will be reached when the whites will become the minority. And therefore that does not seem, at least to me, and I'd like to get your opinion, as a viable long-term solution.
Well, it's a combination of things. I think that part of the essence of our culture is individualism and a respect for the uniqueness of the individual. If we were to lose that completely in a pure race-conscious, collectivist kind of mentality, that would be so awful. I mean, I guess it would be better than the complete disappearance of the white race from the planet Earth, but it's not something that I would want to see.
Won't the host culture be displaced anyway, eventually?
I think it will be, but I think that within whatever survives of a Western culture, those values and those individualistic instincts will survive, at least within that group. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth it.
Small pockets or something.
Yeah. Well, in whatever scale that it exists. Yes. Great.
How well received can these ideas be by black conservatives?
I really don't know.
Is that
I really don't know. I've been in settings. I've never spoken as forthrightly as I have today, but I have been in settings where there were blacks and immigrants and so on, and at first they're shocked to hear somebody saying these things, but you sometimes notice by the end of the evening they'll admit that what you're saying is true. So that's why I say that I really think it would change the whole structure of the situation if more and more whites began speaking this way. Does that answer? I don't know. I mean, obviously we'll get angrier, but I think that right now we're in such a false position that just the fact of speaking the truth would transform things infinitely for the better. Yes.
When it comes time to defending Western culture and Western values, which approach would you prefer? There are two possible approaches. There's one which says, sort of the E.D. Hirsch line, this is our culture. It doesn't even matter if it's better or not. It's ours and we want to keep it. Groups have a right to their own culture. Or do you think it would be better, wiser to take the line, which I think could also be taken, although it gets into deeper waters, it's a superior culture. We've got medicine, we've got science, we've got law. These are things the whole world admires, so it's not just our culture, it's really a better culture by the closest thing to a universal standard. Which would you...
I think both are true. I think we again, the particular and the universal. We want to defend our culture because it's ours and also because it's good.
Better for us.
Better. And I don't know if politically it's useful to say superior, like there was this Florida school district that got in trouble recently for saying that wanting to have in their curriculum it's superior. Now certainly it's understandable why they should want to say that, because the exact opposite assertion is being made everywhere. But I don't know that that's the best way of going.
Certainly it's better for us. Certainly.
Right, but it leads to a kind of a simple-mindedness. But you know, maybe considering the alternatives, that may be that may be a good development. Sir.
This is the curiosity question I had. If I were a black here asking you if I were to opt for the solution of to remain here, what do you envision the world would look? What would my lot in life be were I to remain here in the white society that you envision creating in the new federalist system?
If you're a good person living a good life, I think you could have a very good life. I don't see any. It's impossible to know how these things would work out on the ground. I mean, we just don't know where things are going. As Michael Evans said, we propose ideas and we don't know in what form, if any, they'll ever be manifested. But
Well, I mean,
I don't think that they would have anything to fear from that.
what I need to ask is this. I mean, if I assume with you that I'm less intelligent than you are, 15%, and I'm more violent and irrational, okay, what kind of place am I going to have in a society that doesn't respect and doesn't value these?
Well, look, the condition of black America, say in the 1950s, was in many ways far superior to what it is today. This was in a time when they did not have all these rights. They had. We all remember from our childhood, and there's still many, many black people like this today who are good, decent people, and upright people. And there's no reason why, if the core culture begins to reassert itself and also has to obviously rediscover its own religious and moral basis. I mean, that's a major condition, a major problem. But given that, and given the assertion of the cultural authority coming out of that morality and religion and ethos and so forth, then blacks would find their place within that. And blacks who did well would find jobs suitable to their talents and interests. Criminals would not be coddled. And I think it would be better for most black people, except for those who live for hatred of whites. Sir?
Yeah, Larry, I keep getting back to, like I mentioned with Sam, this thing about action. I want to get your ideas on this. One thing that I think should come out of this conference is that there should be a way to tap resources of people that are here and friends of people that are here, so we can form our own think tank, so we can put out our own position papers, so that there's something that concretely goes on. And also we need to start tapping people with money to provide ongoing professorships or whatever. And what do you think of that idea in universities to continue what we learned here, to other people?
I might interject a point. That sort of concern is the subject of the joint session, the plan of joint session, and there's no harm in your making a comment on that. But
Yeah.
that is really, in some respects, the most difficult question, and it's one that we're going to devote the last session to, in which all of the speakers will be available for their comments, and we will, of course, welcome input from the audience as well.
All right, I'll let that question pass until the later session. Yes, sir.
Yes, you gave two possible scenarios there of how we might deal with this. One, dismantling affirmative action, I assume stopping immigration and treating people as individuals, taking away all these affirmative action rights. The other, a peaceful separation. It's plain when you see black organizations today and black politics today that cannot be put into effect without rioting, terrorism, and essentially a civil war. We want to avoid a civil war. It seems to me therefore the only alternative is your second scenario. They don't want
In the long run, you may very well be right. You know, I still want to hold out the hopeful possibility of something better happening. But once again, if the blacks psychologically today, and that was so brilliant what Michael Levin said about the differences of anger between whites and blacks. The blacks are psychologically have become like a bully, because whites are like the 97-pound weakling, and they keep retreating, and the bully keeps getting more and more aggressive, and so the violence, the hatred, the intimidation that's going on, I think, is mostly a function of this white cowardice. I think if whites began to stand up like civilized, courageous men and women, and stop yielding to bullies and monsters, then a lot of this black aggression would go away. Not all of it, there would be problems, but I'm saying a major part of it would change. In the back row, sir.
Wouldn't we be just postponing the Civil War? You talk about possible Civil War. Wouldn't by further appeasement, wouldn't we just be postponing the Civil War?
Well, I think we must have a separation in partition of the country. This is something which blacks can accept. They will, at that point, be running their own country. They will not be bossed around or second-class citizens in any sense of the word. That's something they can peacefully accept, which many blacks advocate.
For 10 years.
Breaking down.
Okay. Does Mr. Taylor want to say anything? Okay.
I just wanted to
Mr. Levin.
speak to that from my own experience, which is limited, partial, I don't know what it can mean. But in my own case, all the administrators and everything kept telling me, if you continue to teach, there are going to be race riots. Well, the fact is they never materialized. For a couple of weeks, possibly 40 blacks, or groups of 40, 20 whites, 20 blacks, would materialize and break up my classes and so on. But then it completely dissolved, completely. All the allegations, there would be riots, there would be violence, none of it materialized, whatever. And not that I was terribly forceful either. I even withdrew a bit before I decided to stand my ground. So I'm inclined to agree with Larry, that a show of firmness would have a marvelous effect in disarming this anger. That's my hunch. That's my intuition.
The race war going on now.
Well, yeah, because there's
All
no
right,
show.
why don't you respond?
Yes, you were talking. If you try to cut off welfare, if you cut off affirmative action, that's not just words. That's dollars in the pocket. That response is that results in a real response.
The symbolic significance was the same, though, in a sense, because they had defined this as action, to even say these things, and they had sort of stipulated, we're not going to stand for this. And then when it happened, they stood for it.
Yes.
Okay, sir, second round.
You touched on the point that I think that would put these things off. You took it back. Let me summarize. Blacks are not the problem. No white society has any trouble controlling a black population regardless of its size. South Africa controlled them nicely at 16-1 until the rest of the world told them they could not. Blacks are not the problem. It is those whites who voted in. I remember Kennedy. Jesus, I've been in politics since '59. I remember that son of a bitch saying, Kennedy I was talking about. I remember him saying the 1965 Immigration Act would bring almost no change. He was a liar and he knew it. All of those people who have voted these laws onto us, affirmative action is a law. This has been voted onto us. There's the problem. We change it there. We don't change it by bristling. By the way, it was brilliant and I love it. But we don't change it by individually bristling up our back and hoping that some individual or some group will back down. The problem is not blacks. Those we can handle when the whites who put these laws on us get off our backs.
Well, I the way, that is the primary problem is within the diseased soul of white America and the Western world, but the numbers do begin to become a problem. And certainly, when you realize the vested interest that the black middle class has in affirmative action, I mean, their livelihood would be directly threatened by changes in affirmative action. But it's not just right wingers like the people at this conference who are saying these things. I heard Stefan Thernstrom at a conference sponsored by Linda Chavez at the Manhattan Institute in New York a few months ago. Mr. D'Souza was also a speaker at this conference. Thernstrom was speaking about affirmative action, and after his talk, a questioner asked him, Mr. Thernstrom, would you be willing to accept the point, if we get rid of affirmative action and so forth, would you be willing to accept a Harvard college where there are almost no blacks? And Thernstrom said, yes. He's a liberal. Over here, please.
It's been my observation, not just mine, that with right-wing, accept this term, gatherings, the numbers of women are vastly in the minority. Right. And I was wondering, what do you think is the cause of the hostility among many white women towards a movement such as this?
Well, first of all, women are, if you go to any conservative meeting, including, establishment neoconservative meetings, it's a big preponderance of men.
Except for Eagle Forum.
Okay. 3 chairs to fill a shop. But again, Jared had a good article about this in American Renaissance a couple of years ago. I think women do function more on a basis of feeling and love, and men operate more on a basis of principle. And while love can be the basis of, and should be the basis of personal life and the family, it cannot be the basis of society. A society based on love will destroy itself. And that's why, I don't think we should be altogether disturbed about that. I think that, civilization, the larger structure of society, does depend predominantly upon men. I hope I'm not about to be.
The woman is actually.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Auster, I just wanted to point out to you and to all of the other people who've been bashing Miami and the Cubans for bringing this rejection of the English as an official language on us. It's really not the Cubans. I'm from Miami, part of the time anyhow, and I never met a Cuban. I never knew a Cuban personally who was in favor of this. They were always eager to learn English, especially the ones that came in the early 60s. Now, the lower class black Cubans who came later weren't willing to fight for this issue, but it was white liberals like Wimpy Mayor Steve Clark who led this movement because they're trying to curry favor with
Well, it was a Hispanic majority Board of Supervisors of Dade County that had this recent vote that overturned the official English law.
Well, they were embarrassed to go against the white liberals who really were leading this movement. This is the way I feel strongly about this. They were afraid to appear self-hating by not taking a little bit of leadership.
There is a symbiotic effect here. Now, certainly, I will not deny the argument that white liberals and so on are a major part of all this.
And Rush's a wimp too. He knows exactly what's happening in Oregon. He's just too wimpy to talk about it.
Maybe. I just want to respond to one point that was sort of implied in what you were saying. It's this argument that it's the leadership that's the problem, not the rank and file. And you hear this all the time. It's just the ethnic elites, it's just the activist organizations, and so forth. This is a fallacious argument because in any group, it's the leaders that make things happen. It was the elite that created this country. A big part of the population of the colonies wasn't that interested in a revolution. But yet, the elite represents the fundamental direction of the country and leads it. So, probably the population of Somalia does not like living in total violence. And if you ask them in an opinion poll, would you like to be living under a peaceful government? They would say yes. However, that's not the kind of elite that they have, being the kind of culture and people that they are. That's what makes a third world culture different from a first world culture. Thank you very much.